So I thought I'd let you know what it feels like or what one does when the reviews come back from the editor and the critical readers of a journal. And so what I won't share with you is the 2 weeks of anguish and wailing and gnashing of teeth that goes ahead. But then once that's settled down and you sit starting to work. So the review form here from the Electronic Journal of E-Learning is more or less the same as any review form that you'd get for any journal. And so I'm just sharing that so that you can have an idea of what it looks like. So there's my paper reference, and this is the name of the paper, is Designing Question for Research Design and Design Research in E-Learning. And this is what they're asking. So in reviewer A wants to know, or at least reviewer one, and the first question they ask here is, does the introduction provide an adequate framing for the paper and a sufficient overview of the background to the research problem? And that's what they usually ask. This guy is quite kind. He's giving me 6, and he gives his comment. Introduction reflects the paper content outlining, introduction reflects the paper content, which is outlining a model to be used to test a number of selected articles from past volumes of this journal in order to explore the extent to which articles can be classified into research paradigms and propose linked research questions for each article. There are minor errors, and so he gives them. Then what I do is I just type in here what I do. And then here he says in one of the tables, there's text missing in one quadrant. And there's a reason for that, and I explain that reason later. So then in bold, I just type what I did, because at the later stage, I've got to give them a table that shows what changes I made. And so then I can just cut and paste this and paste it into the other one. The next item they're looking for is the research problem, and the research and they want to know from the critical readers, is the research problem articulated clearly with an appropriate rationale and justification of its importance? And he says, yes, the research problem is presented with clarity, and but I need to expand on the justification. What problem needs to be solved and why? Now, interestingly enough, the reviewer 2 actually gives me this sentence and actually explains what it is that I did. And so I borrowed that from reviewer 2 and I put it into the article. And so I'm just putting it here so that I will be able to put that into the table, my response table. Then they ask about the literature review. They want to know, is it comprehensive? Does it have an exhaustive coverage of all available and contemporary literature? And is it a critical analysis which further expounds the problem? And here I'm quite lucky, excellent theoretical grounding underpinning the proposed research problem, a thorough critical analysis of the literature. Remember, a critical analysis, that means that you're not only saying what the literature says, but you're actually saying what the literature does not say. And in that way, you explain why this research is necessary. So I get an 8 for that, which makes me quite happy. Then the research design and methods. They want to know, is the research clearly described with adequate justification for the choice of methods and a clear account of how the evidence was analyzed? In general, accepted norms of good research practice upheld. That's what they want to know. So I get a poor mark for that, 3. This is where I get smacked. Funny enough, I always run into trouble with my research design section in my papers. And so I try and spend much more time on them now, and still I seem to not get it. So they say it's a detailed model underpinned by literature. The method as it currently stands is weak. I should include a thorough explanation of the convenience sampling that I did and support it from the literature. I must provide examples of other similar studies that happened there. And I said I went through the articles that they want to know, did I do it manually? I must describe it in detail. And I must also explain what is meant by going through the whole contents of all the volumes, etc. And he says the section needs to be improved. And this is really valuable advice that he gives here. Consider if a colleague would like to do the same, to replicate your work. So you need to describe it in such a way that somebody else can actually also do it. So that was very useful for me. So then I reworked the whole section. And in fact, in the process, I discovered that I hadn't been doing convenience sampling. I'd actually done purposive sampling and, in fact, typical case sampling and not convenience sampling. And I found a reference to support that. And then I explained going through as a close reading, and I also provided an example. And you'll see that later. So now we come to the findings and discussions, and the reviewers must tell the editor, is the evidence or empirical data presented in the article, is that adequate? And they want to know, is the discussion detailed, and does it indicate the depth of insight which provides a firm foundation making to the contribution of the body of knowledge? And I get a 7 for that, which is good. And then it says that it's underpinned by the paradigms, it relates back to the literature, it's well explained and illustrated, but I need to add page numbers with citations and figures and so on, which of course I'll do. Then they want to know about the contribution of the paper. And they say, does it make a useful contribution to promotion and development of new knowledge in the field? And will it generate further interest and debate? Generate further interest and debate. And I get 7. It says a useful model, and it tests it using a number of selected papers from previous volumes of this journal. This is a useful tool for others and sure to generate further studies in the development of new knowledge. Now, something just to look at is this, what I did here, selected papers from previous volumes of this journal. What I did here is to analyze previous papers of their journal, which means that this article is very relevant to them. But that's a chance of that you take, because just say they don't want the article, then no other journal would be interested in publishing an analysis of another journal. So it's a risk, but in this case, it paid off. Then we look at the conclusions. Do they demonstrate a firm grasp of the key issues? Do they summarize the salient contributions? And do they provide direction for further work? I get a 5. And it says I must give the limitations and future work, which I then did. And I look at the technical methodology section is weak since previous comments. Abstract needs to be attended to show how it was useful, and so on. And then other specific technical issues, grammar, spelling, citation style, and so on. And they make no further recommendations, and they say accepted with modifications. Then we get to reviewer 2. And I'm really lucky with reviewer 2 because he actually gives me even higher grades than the previous one. Reviewer 2 is much more enthusiastic, but what he gives negative, the other one gives negative, and what he gives is positive, the other one gives positive. He just has a broader palette. So the first question then again about adequate framing. Reviewer 2 says it continues the conversation about an issue previously discussed in an early paper in the journal. So he saw that. He says the problem is clearly articulated and is central to discussion of e-learning. So I get a 10 for that. Literature review, I get full marks for, and he says that's good. But then when we get to research design, he calls it desk-based research, which is very useful, adequate justification, but he says I must justify convenience sampling and papers better, and I must give the reason why I did it. And so I added all that. And I say here an explanation has been added to clarify. Then we look at the findings. This is detailed enough, and it makes a contribution, and it gives me an excellent. And then I get full marks for the contribution of the paper. And this is what I really like. I would recommend it to my students. So those of you who are going to review papers, if you are enthusiastic about a paper, then say things like that, because it's really useful. Then he gives the it tells us the conclusions show, but there's insufficient discussion on future research. So I've learned something from this, is the limitations of a study and further research one really needs to add. And so I added that. Technical stuff, he shows me some errors and some technical things, which I'm not going to look at now. And then he gives what I could do to improve it. Expand on the first paragraph to show the ongoing conversation, provide justification for the 9 papers, why only they, and how do they indicate the paradigm, and then why did I select from the paper, and so I explained that. So a couple of little changes that he asked there, and then he also says accept after changes. And so that's what I got from the 2 authors, from the 2 reviewers. So now let's have a look at the table that I gave back to the authors. So it's author's response to reviewers, a paper number and title, and then my description. So that's what the reviewer 1 said, and this is what I did. And this is what the second comment was, and this is what I did. So I just cut and paste all the things that I did and then put this inside this table. You'll remember that in my notes, in my response, when I went through the reviewer comments, I typed in my responses there. So it comes into a table like this, and then the table goes off to the journal together with the article with track changes that I'm going to show you now. Okay, so remember they said I must add another line to explain the problem in the abstract, which I then add. Models propose a solution to the ongoing problem of heterogeneity of research problems. I talk about Burrell and Morgan. I discovered when I counted it was 8 papers, not 9, even though they also said 9. And then as they required, I added the further research that I would be doing. Then the sentence that a reviewer gave me, that comes in here as a statement of the problem. There seems to be a lack of clarity in terms of what's being researched as well as how it's being researched. Somehow the stated aim of a research project does not match the eventual outcome. Key reason for this may be the misalignment of research aims and research questions. And then I say what this article is going to do about it, and so on. Now, remember they said that there was a table that I needed to explain. It's this one here, and I'll show you quickly. It says the figure shows that research can be high in considerations or in of use and in considerations of understanding, or high in both. But the fourth quadrant remains empty, as no research can be low in use and low in understanding. So just to explain this to you for interest's sake, Stokes says that all research can either be inspired by be useful and contribute to fundamental understanding. Bohr's research is really there for fundamental understanding rather than useful. Edison's research is really useful rather than fundamental understanding, and Pasteur's is both. So this one is neither understanding nor use, and so that is the quadrant of myths, legends, and fake news. And I added Stokes's page number because they asked for that. And then this is how the article goes. And now we tell the problem. Problem that is addressed by this model lies in the alignment of research aims and questions. Novice researchers often state research aim and then mention a number of questions, but there's no clear link showing how answering those questions will lead to achieving the aim. And then the literature survey that they liked. So you'll see I didn't do much change in the literature survey, but what you can see in the literature survey is how it builds up. So I start with my original model, with Burrell and Morgan's model. Then I add to it my 4 verbs that I use. Many of you will remember this article of mine. And then the dimension, subjective, objective, and then I look at society of radical change, and I look at Ackoff's virtue, power, value, and knowledge. And so it builds up the literature. And so that's what they liked, and that's why they thought it was rather a good literature review. Then I talk about McKinney's design research cycle, and so on. And now we get to the bit where most of the changes had to be done. Remember, reviewer 2 said it was a desk study. So here I say, in this desk study, the articles were selected by way of purpose of sampling, known as typical case sampling, which is useful when a researcher is dealing with large programs. It helps set the bar or the standard of what is typical. And there's the authors that I found there. And then I say the sampling was done with a close reading, and then I give criteria for including the paper, and I explain it by way of an example. And then I tell how I did it and what I did. And that's more or less what I had to change in the article. Then we have the discussion, and then some additions that I put for clarity, that sometimes you need to change the verbs and so on. That you can read in the article if you like. And then we carry on, and I explain all the various quadrants. And then comes the bit that they wanted me to add, which is limitations and further work. So the first limitation, only 8 articles, and so the article is really just a proof of concept. Empirical verification, the model can be done by training a number of critical readers to scrutinize a particular canon and classify the text accordingly. One could then determine high levels of, or the level of inter-rater validity to see the extent to which the model is transferable between readers. Then I look at a further limitation of the model, lies in the fact that the terms are open to interpretation, and I explained that. I did that up front. And then finally, the model is there for an initial tool to assist readers. It's not a recipe. And that is the story. So that is how I addressed these questions and how it went back to the editor, and it was eventually published, and I will let you have a copy of that as well.